Hey guys, I've got to take a little bit of time off to deal with some important things on the home front. And our team here at Pelican Plus is posting my greatest hits, let's call them, of some older videos that I've done, which may be new to you if you haven't seen them before. For those of you who are watching this on Substack and you are a paid subscriber, make sure that you click down underneath for the post explaining how to migrate over to Pelican Plus. And if you're someone who's never subscribed before, now's as good a time as any. There's a link down there for you as well. All right, enjoy the show. Hello, Kennedy. You recently talked about a theological issue concerning episcopacy during your recent Blunt Challenge video, where you mentioned that the SSPX is simply acting in accords with the majority consensus of the theological issue. Can you tell us more about that? What are some sources and references where we can learn about this more? More. Thank you. Great question. So I did a video appealing to the Zoomer apologist types, the voice of reason types, and so forth. Basically saying, cool it, guys. You guys are using a lot of really strong language on things you don't really understand. And there are a number of questions that are that are being disputed and have been in recent decades that theologians are going to take a long time to get to the bottom of. And you don't really know what you don't know was kind of my point. And one of these major ones that comes up in the SSPX debate is the issue of ordination of bishops, of consecration of bishops. So if you look in the Second Vatican Council, I want to say it's in Lumen Gentium. Because that's on I think that's the constitution of the church, and Gaudium et Spes is church in the modern world, I'm pretty sure. But I think it's in Lumen Gentium, and basically it insinuates that when a bishop is consecrated, he receives both power and jurisdiction through the act of consecration. And that is an anomaly as far as an official opinion. It's a minority opinion that has been held at times in the past, but it's never been the majority opinion. And it's a really important distinction. And there is a resource that I'm going to just pull up here for you quickly. So here is, I'll link this underneath, but this is a study by Father Glaze, Father Michel, is it Michel? Yeah, Jean-Michel Glaze. And he's the society's probably preeminent theologian. Him and Father Calderon have been seen as such. And so the debate that goes on largely between the Fraternity of St. Peter and the SSPX. So if Vatican II is the teaching in the sense of how consecrations work of bishops, if it's true that you receive power, meaning like what makes you a bishop as far as like the powers you have, so you can consecrate, ordain priests and things like that. And you also receive jurisdiction, like the jurisdiction itself is of the divine nature of the office. Then it's impossible to ever consecrate bishops without permission, without some sort of schismatic reality. That's the argument from those who hold the minority opinion. And the Fraternity of St. Peter theologians, and this does not represent every priest in the fraternity, but the stuff they publish for their theologians are very much of this Vatican II opinion. Whereas up until Vatican II, this was never seen as the de facto teaching of the church. And in this article, Father Glaze points that out. So he gives a preamble, basically what I just said. And he says, we owe it to Pius XII. We owe him important clarifications, or so we owe to him important clarifications concerning the nature of the episcopate and its place in the divine constitution of the church. And these are in three documents primarily. They're Mystici Corporis from 1943, Ad Sinarum Gentem, 1954, and the encyclical Ad Apostolorum Principis. And the second and third documents refer to the teaching spelled out in the first, and they develop it. And the reason why this was done was to denounce and sort out the problem of the schismatic Chinese Patriotic Church. So at the time, this was being tested. So there were ordinations and consecrations going on in China that were against the explicit will of the Holy Father, and they had no permission to do so, and they set up this parallel church. And in condemning that, Pope Pius XII cleared up how the episcopacy works and sort of laid the inner workings out about that. So we can just go through some of it here. So in the encyclical Mystici Corporis,
Pius XII says, the essential idea, he says, um, he's dealing with the developing and explaining, above all, those points which concern the church militant. And the author says the essential idea, which will be repeated in other documents to follow, is that the church is the body of Christ in the sense in which Christ is the head of the society of the church. In other words, the one who governs it and communicates its vital impulse to it. So what makes it the church, what makes it alive. But Christ exercises this invisible governance by means of the governance of his vicar placed at the head of a visible hierarchy. The essential clarification is operative here in determining the place of the episcopate, understood in the sense of a power of jurisdiction, in other words, in the sense of an authority founded on the power to govern the church, while dependent on its supreme head, Christ. So what he's basically saying is that this authority of the Pope to govern, this power of jurisdiction, is of Christ and given to the church and utilized, let's say, by the Holy Father. This power of jurisdiction is found in the Vicar of Christ is a universal supreme power. So he has the supreme authority over the church. And this power is universal because the Pope exercises it to govern all the members of the church, and it is supreme because every other authority in the church is subordinate to that of the Pope. And those are the first clarifications given by Pius XII. Oops. Oopsie daisy. And Pius XII says, we must not think that he rules only in a hidden or extraordinary manner. On the contrary, our Redeemer also governs his mystical body in a visible and normal way through his vicar on earth. So he's laying out the foundations that there's a visible church with a visible head. So it's not like you can go and start your own thing and say, I have the authority of Christ, because you need to see that visibly. And this is why groups that separate themselves from the Roman pontiff separate themselves from the church. Pius XII says, they therefore walk in the path of dangerous error who believe that they can accept Christ as the head of the church while not adhering loyally to his vicar on earth. And this is what we're saying. And he even says, those who are seeking the haven of eternal salvation can neither see it nor find it if they do it in that way. There's no salvation outside the church. This was reiterated by Pius XII. Oops. However, Pius XII offers other clarifications. Because although Christ appointed St. Peter and his successor as visible heads of the whole church, he also willed to confer part of the authority in his church to others besides his vicar. This is where the bishops come in. So it is that the bishops receive a power of jurisdiction, not supreme, but subordinate to that of the Pope, not universal, but restricted to definite limits. And this is why we have territorial jurisdictions where the bishop has his authority in that place. The bishops, therefore, necessarily are a part of the divine constitution of the church, and Pius XII explains that authority in the mystical body of Christ is distributed proportionally between that of the Pope and that of the bishops. Pius XII says, what we have thus far said of the universal church must be understood also of the individual Christian communities, whether Oriental or Latin, so the different rites in the church, which go to make up the one Catholic Church. For they too are ruled by Jesus Christ through the voice and jurisdiction of their respective bishops. As far as his own diocese is concerned, each one, as a true shepherd, feeds the flock entrusted to him and rules it in the name of Christ. So, to speak in layman's terms here, a bishop is like a pope of a diocese. It's a very important thing, and it's of divine right. Okay. Continuing. This complexity of the church's government calls for a third clarification, and Pius XII carefully explains how the Pope's power and that of the bishops are connected. And this is the passage that contains the important facts that will be repeated subsequently in other encyclicals. Although it is true that the bishops govern, each one by virtue of an ordinary and proper power, the part of the church's flock that is assigned to them, they exercise this power while dependent on the Pope's primacy of jurisdiction, and this is for two reasons. And why is he pointing these things out? So it's showing that, yes, the bishops have an office that is of divine institution, but they are dependent on the jurisdiction of the Pope for that territorial jurisdiction. First, because in the very exercise of this power, they remain subject to the Pope. Secondly, because the very power that they exercise is communicated to them by the Pope. Their subordination is explained, therefore, not only by reason of their exercise of power, but also and more radically by reason of the very being of this power, which is received as a participation in the power of the Pope. In other words, as a participation in the power of the Vicar of Christ, and therefore as a participation in the very power of Christ through that of the Pope. This very important clarification from Pius XII, he says, "Yet in exercising this office, the bishops are not altogether independent, but are subordinate to the lawful authority of the Roman pontiff, although enjoying the ordinary power of jurisdiction which they receive directly from the same pontiff." And this is why this is so important. So, when we're talking about matters of schism, we're talking about matters of basically authority and jurisdiction. So if it's the case that bishops receive their power, which it says, which they receive directly from the same supreme pontiff, then that means that they receive this power of jurisdiction not from the consecration itself, but from the authority of the Pope in an explicit sense. So basically, you can consecrate bishops who have the powers of bishops, so they can do the sacramental things bishops do. But for them to be in charge of a diocese and have that territorial jurisdiction, this must be given to them directly from the Pope. Why is this important? Well, because if you receive jurisdiction and power, the power to do the bishop's sacramental stuff, by the way of consecration, then there's no way to separate there's no way, they're not separate. They're not distinct from one another. So if, the bishop of my diocese decides to go consecrate a bishop, it's necessarily a schismatic act if he doesn't have permission to give that bishop a place to govern, because there's this assumption that he's being consecrated and there necessarily is a territorial jurisdiction notion attached to it. So he is basically governing a church that is not in communion with the Pope. That's the notion there. And that's the argument from Vatican II, basically, that the fraternity and others follow. However, if it is true that you could consecrate bishops with no territorial jurisdiction, and they could just receive the power of doing bishop things, then although you may sin in another way, disobedience, etc., you're not actually setting them up to govern any church that's not in communion with the church, because each diocese is considered in its own right like a particular church. It's like a church within a church. So if you're going to be in charge of a place, that place has to be in the empire of the church. If you think about, when you look at the history of Europe and the Roman Empire, you see how the church works. You have these empires within empires, these principalities within kingdoms. So there's kind of like the one head of everything. And then there's the various heads of their areas that they have in a sense supreme authority over that place, but they're subordinate to the supreme head of all. And that is the emperor, or in this case, the Pope. So what the traditional teaching is that bishops could be consecrated without any jurisdiction attached to it or any territorial area implied in the consecration. And if that's the case, then again, one could sin in a different way, but the notion of schism in the sense that many believe it is not present. So before Vatican II, you can justify Archbishop Lefebvre's consecrations of bishops. After Vatican II, those who follow the novelty in the Second Vatican Council, which was a minority opinion never defined, those who follow that can claim schism. And that's what I was talking about in that video. Let's see if we can continue with a little bit here. So here's something from Pius XII saying what I'm saying, but saying it better than me. And this is from one of the subsequent documents. And it says, where is it? As has also been divinely established, the power of orders through which the ecclesiastical hierarchy is composed of bishops, priests, and ministers, comes from receiving the sacrament of holy orders. So that's the power of orders, to do the sacramental stuff. But the power of jurisdiction, which is conferred upon the supreme pontiff directly by divine right, flows to the bishops by the same right, but only through the successor of Peter. So, you don't receive the power of jurisdiction in the consecration itself. So there's no notion of jurisdiction or territorial authority attached to the consecration itself. That's a traditional teaching. And therefore, you could consecrate bishops without permission, but without schism, because you're not actually setting up a church. The novel idea is that you necessarily set up a separate church, which was never understood as the teaching of the church. This is why it's a problem. The problem is that Vatican II, they took the minority opinion and sort of loosely explained it, but it was never defined, and there's been this conflict amongst theologians. Also, when we look to church history, we do find, for example, St. Eusebius of Samosata, who was Orthodox. He's a saint, and he was Orthodox. This is long before the schism, so I mean Orthodox in the small o sense, like he was not a heretic. And he went around and basically went to dioceses where there were Arians who had been installed legitimately but had adopted the heresy. And he set up bishops to govern those dioceses because they're heretics and they can't be trusted. And he set up legitimate bishops with no permission to do so, who acted as the bishops, much further than Archbishop Lefebvre went. And also, Cardinal Slipy, who was a Ukrainian bishop, he became a cardinal under John Paul II, which is so ironic, as you'll understand why when I say in a second. In the 1970s, Paul VI was explicit that there would be no consecrations of bishops in the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The reason being was because they had this policy of not poking the bear of the Soviet communists. Whenever they did something, they would be smacked down, and they wanted to sort of try their best to not ruffle feathers, which there's a reason for that policy. It wasn't just Paul VI who did it. I think it was Pius XI who kind of started it in the beginning, I think, with dealing with the Soviets. In any event, Cardinal Slipy was in a gulag for many years. He finally gets out and goes to Rome. And he's like, I need bishops. We need bishops. There's like 1 or 2 bishops left in all of Ukraine for Catholics, and they're going to die. We need bishops. And he was not given permission. So he didn't even ask for permission. And he basically escaped, or like left unannounced, went to Ukraine and consecrated a number of bishops with no permission. And he was not excommunicated or labeled a schismatic. And in fact, he was made a cardinal under Paul VI's successor. And Cardinal Slipy is seen as a hero, even by George Weigel, who is the papal biographer of John Paul II, because it was seen that there was a clear state of necessity because of the communism. Well, I agree, but there's also a state of necessity to do so without permission because of the modernism. But the point being is this demonstrates to us that even after the Second Vatican Council, when put to the test, the idea that you could consecrate bishops with no permission and not be seen as a schismatic, this was not, nothing was clear about this. No, it wasn't a de facto ruling that you necessarily had to be a schismatic because you did that. The argument in favor of the Ukrainian bishop would be probably that he set them up in dioceses that were without bishops and needed them. Fair enough, but he did so without permission, is the point. And Archbishop Lefebvre did not set anybody up in any diocese, so there can't be any territorial aspect attached to it anyway. Just more of the confusion after the Second Vatican Council. And Father Glaze clarifies here, or adds to it, and he says, therefore, a distinction is made here not only between 2 powers of different natures, but also between 2 different ways of communicating one power and the other. The power of order, which in the case of a bishop is the power to confer holy orders and to administer the sacrament of confirmation, is communicated by the reception itself of holy orders. For instance, when a bishop ordains a priest or when a bishop performs the episcopal consecration of another bishop. The power of jurisdiction, in contrast, is communicated by the Pope directly to the Pope directly by Christ on the occasion of the acceptance of his election to the supreme pontificate, and is communicated to bishops only through the successor of Peter. In other words, as far as the Pope communicates to the bishop by an act of his will, participation in the power of jurisdiction that he himself holds in its fullness as vicar of Christ. So historically, for roughly the first 1,000 years, the idea that there would be this communication with the Pope and submitting candidates to be approved by Rome to be made bishops, this was not always done. I'm sure it was done in some cases that were very close to Rome, but with travel and things like that and communication, obviously it could take months to have any communication at times. And bishops were historically elected for their diocese by their brother bishops in neighboring areas, and sometimes even by the faithful of the diocese. That there's no divinely inspired process for how this has to take place. But how you would have the assurity that this bishop would be made or would be accepted as the official bishop is then basically after his consecration, whether he was elected by the people or whether he was elected or selected by his brother bishops in neighboring areas, or sometimes it was by the priests of the diocese and they would select one of their own, things like that, different ways. Then basically communication would be sent to Rome and the Pope would basically say, I accept this. And it was sort of a retroactive acceptance that this man is the rightful bishop and so on and so forth. And this was a clear manifestation of the act of the will of the bishop or of the Pope to recognize that this man had the jurisdiction to do what he had to do and therefore was in communion with him. Now, what's interesting about that, though, is that there would often be periods of time where there had not been communication yet, but the bishops of those dioceses would be acting as bishops. Why is this important? Because there's this notion of this potential jurisdiction. There's this notion of the fact that for the good of the souls, the church supplies a jurisdiction. So, for example, let's say Bishop so-and-so dies, and this is the year 500. Bishop so-and-so dies, and it's like it's a 6-week voyage to get to Rome. It's going to take a while. Okay. So let's say he dies, and there are many priests ready to be ordained. So they select a bishop. He's consecrated by neighboring bishops, or the priest, or the people, whatever. And then he performs the consecrations of the priests. Now, let's just say by the time word gets to Rome that this man has been selected bishop, the Pope basically says, not on my watch. This is hypothetical, by the way. And you must select somebody else. I don't know what you do with that. But the point is, there's nothing wrong. Those priests who were ordained by this bishop who was rejected ultimately, there's no debate there about whether or not they're in communion with the church. Because the jurisdiction itself exists for the good of the souls. It exists for the society of the church. And therefore, there is this notion that it's supplied when necessary. Because remember, it's given to the Holy Father directly by Christ, and this is communicated by the act of the will of the Holy Father to the various candidates and so forth. However, there can be impossibilities in that taking place because of travel, because of sickness, because of distance, because of death, whatever. And for the good of the church and of the souls, this is directly communicated by the church because it exists there in potential for those ministers. See what I'm saying? And understanding this in the traditional way is what makes it very easy to justify what the SSPX does. One may disagree with their opinion about the crisis, but that one would act in a certain way during such a crisis. This is easily understood in the traditional understanding of how power and jurisdiction works for bishops. Let's see if there's anything else in this that is necessary. Give me half a second here to find a passage. So this is fascinating. If we think about our situation with Cardinal Schlippe, who was this Ukrainian Greek Catholic cardinal, who was made a cardinal, even though he did a very Archbishop Lefebvre-esque thing. And it says here, bishops who have neither been named nor confirmed. Remember, you can be named by the Apostolic See explicitly, or you can be confirmed after you've been elected. We talked about that process. But who, on the contrary, have been elected and consecrated in defiance of its express orders, enjoying no powers of teaching or of jurisdiction. But again, in the case of Cardinal Schlippe, he was not approved. It took years before those bishops were actually approved. But they governed as bishops, and then essentially once it's approved, it's basically retroactively ratified, if that makes sense. Father Glaze continues, he says, a distinction is made here between, on the one hand, the bishops who were neither appointed nor confirmed by the Pope, without yet having been consecrated, and on the other hand, those who were neither appointed nor confirmed by the Pope, but have been consecrated against his decision. The fact of conferring episcopal consecration and of communicating the power of order against the Pope's will only aggravates the attack already made against church unity without causing it. What causes it is the fact of pretending to communicate the power of jurisdiction in conferring an appointment, which is the bishop's responsibility or the Pope's responsibility, his alone. So what he's saying here is the real thing that causes the disunity and the division, according to Pius XII, is pretending to communicate the power of jurisdiction in conferring an appointment. So, Pope says, no, you can't do that. You say, to heck with that. He's our new bishop for our diocese. That's where schism comes in. Here's the thing. Archbishop Lefebvre never did that. He was very clear about that. No jurisdiction. Their mandate is not to govern an area. It is only to basically be given the power of orders in order to continue the ordination of priests and confirmations. But no jurisdiction. Very clear. He was clear about that when he literally consecrated the men in the sermon of the ceremony. That was said out loud, so no one could. Those who read something into it that's not there, they just don't take Archbishop Lefebvre at his word, which isn't fair because, I mean, he's telling you what he's doing, and that's what he's doing. He's not doing something else. But this is very important because what's interesting about this document, and I'll link it underneath, we won't go through more of it because we could talk about it for 2 hours. But what's interesting about this is Father Glaze is using Pius XII's documents that condemn the actions of the Chinese Patriotic Church. Rightfully so. Because what they did was, to heck with your jurisdiction, we're setting up these bishops anyway. Well, there's a schismatic church. And this is why you've had the underground church in China. And I think it was, I was talking to Stephen Mosher, I believe. And he was it might have been him or was someone else from China. But Stephen Mosher talks about China a lot. And he was at this, this was back before the recent agreement between the Vatican and China, which has been a disaster. But anyway, he was in China and he was at this parish and there was a nun who was like, would you like to meet the bishop? And he said, sure. And this old man comes out dressed in lay clothes from this office or whatever. And they're like, that's our bishop. And he's like, what? And, oh no, he's the true bishop because he's not part of the Patriotic Church. He was consecrated in secret, et cetera, but he's our true bishop of our underground church. So you've had this parallel church thing going on in China. And in any event, the Patriotic Church is condemned. And in doing so, Pius XII explains how the episcopacy works. So Father Glaze is a master theologian, and he's saying, no, we have what it means to condemn bishops. And let's just look at or condemn consecrated bishops that were done wrongly. Let's look at why they're condemned and what it means to be condemned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he shows in that, teasing it out, that this can't be applied to the Society of St. Pius X, et cetera, because that's not how the episcopacy works. So if you consecrate bishops and do not, you don't give them a jurisdiction, you don't pretend to, et cetera, then you're not falling under those condemnations which would constitute some sort of schism. Now, of course, you should not do what Archbishop Lefebvre did, or what St. Eusebius did, or what Cardinal Schlippi did, etc. You shouldn't do that, normally speaking. But the point is that in those extreme circumstances where things are nuts, that we see the nature of how it works and how in a state of necessity, whether it be communism, whether it be Arianism, whether it be modernism, whatever, that consecrating bishops for the health of the faithful and for the continuation of the priesthood does not in and of itself constitute a schismatic act based on the nature of the episcopacy. Problem with Vatican II comes along, has a novel teaching that is a minority opinion found before, but does not constitute the majority opinion historically of the church and has not been defined as such. And this, we should probably discuss briefly, though, why that's even possible. Well, you see, there are certain questions that are disputed by theologians, and until the point that they're defined by the church, then a downright action or downright statement on the capital T teaching, capital T, of the church has not yet been made. So certainly And now, that doesn't mean that if something has not been infallibly defined, you can do whatever you want. But for grave reason, if there is another piece of information, then you could have a reason to doubt, et cetera, and you could communicate that in some way. And that's what you see theologians doing. So the modernists who inspired this confusion understood how that worked, and they inserted in their novel opinion in Vatican II, and we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. So I'll put that underneath, but I hope that answers your question. Great question.